everyone, welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, South Korean President Moon has proposed the military and family reunion dialogue to the DPRK. But will Kim Jong Un consent to Moon's offer? An interview with scientists who want to use existing technology to mitigate humanity's footprint. Today we speak to Professor Andrew Gonzalez to solve the loss of biodiversity. And we will also check in on the US-China 100-day action plan agreed by President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump. This plan includes Chinese cooked chicken reaching the US markets, while US beef heads in the other direction. And we begin today's program with the Korean Peninsula tensions. South Korea has proposed to restart military and family reunion talks with the DPRK. The proposals follow up President Moon Jae-in's speech in Berlin earlier this month when he called on both sides to end the hostilities. If the DPRK agrees, the talks could be and would be the first of their kind in almost 3 years. To know more about this, take a look.
It's time to restart talks. South Korean President Moon Jae-in's government made its first formal overture to the DPRK on Monday with a proposal to negotiate ways to avoid hostile acts near the heavily militarized border.
We hope that the DPRK can respond to our proposal, which aims to halt all acts of hostility near the military demarcation line.
South Korea also proposed Red Cross talks to resume a humanitarian project to reunite families separated during the Korean War in the early 1950s. The last such reunions took place in October 2015. Up till now, the DPRK has not responded to their proposals. South Korean President Moon Jae-in has long signaled he wants closer engagement with the DPRK. In a recent speech in Berlin, Mr. Moon said dialogue with the DPRK was more pressing than ever, and he called for a peace treaty to be signed. He said such dialogue was crucial for those who seek the end of Pyongyang's nuclear weapons program. However, the DPRK's frequent missile tests, including the most recent one of an intercontinental ballistic missile, are in consistent violation of UN resolutions and have alarmed its neighbors and the US. China has always believed that an improvement in the bilateral relationship and progress in reconciliation and cooperation serve the fundamental interests of the two sides and contribute to regional peace and development.
We hope the two sides can work together to create conditions for breaking the ice and restoring negotiations. We also hope all relevant parties in the international community can understand and support the efforts being made by the two sides to play a constructive role in properly resolving the nuclear issues on the Korean Peninsula.
The proposals given by the ROK government has put the DPRK into a dilemma, and the US proposed the UN to impose new sanctions on the DPRK just a couple of days ago. Facing the heavy pressure, how the DPRK will respond is worth a look.
So, could the proposed bilateral talks help dial back tensions in the Korean Peninsula? Let's get our answers from our panelists. Joining us here in Beijing, Teng Jianqun, Director of the American Studies Department at the China Institute of International Studies. It's wonderful to have you back onto our program, sir. Also joining us in New York, James Kim, a research fellow at the Asang Institute of Policy Studies. Welcome as well. In Washington, D.C., we are having Mr. Jonathan Pollack, well known, of course, on the issue of Korean Peninsula, who is the interim SK Korea Foundation Chair in Korea Studies at the Center for East Asian Policy Studies, Senior Fellow, John Thornton China Center, Brookings Institution. Welcome to the three of you. First of all, shall I go to Mr. Kim in South Korea? What do you make of this proposal? Is this a simple repeat of the earlier offer by South Korea to DPRK at various stages? Or this is a recognition of new opening of opportunities for the two sides to really work out something?
I believe that this is a different approach. President Moon has made his intentions clear during the Berlin Declaration while he was visiting Germany on the G20 summit. His stopover in Berlin, he has stated his intention to try to seek dialogue with the North Koreans. This is a different kind of an approach than the one that was proposed earlier in coordination with the United States, where the Allies would try to get the North Koreans to come to the bargaining table on their terms. But it seems that Mr. Moon is exploring the possibility of different kinds of dialogues with North Korea, and it'd be interesting to see whether he succeeds in this regard.
Mr. Polak, compared to Seoul's offer to Pyongyang about two dialogues, Washington now is trying to propose more sanctions against the DPRK at the United Nations. When these two combine together, will they be even more strengthful than they are being used individually? Or this is very different approaches the two governments feel they should have toward the DPRK?
Well, when it's good to talk to you, Tianwei.
Great to have you, sir.
When President Moon met with President Trump, that there was an agreement between the two presidents that South Korea would attempt to use possible engagement of certain kinds with North Korea, if possible, if there was a response on the other end of the phone, so to speak. So far, frankly, North Korea has given South Korea no encouragement whatsoever. Maybe the fact that they have not responded to yesterday's offer is at least a partial positive sign. But what President Moon understands is that he has a limited space in which he is trying to operate to see if there is any meaningful possibility for sensible tension reduction measures along the DMZ, perhaps in the Northern Islands. We'll see, but I must say, so far the responses from North Korea have been very negative. North Korea 3 days ago, issued its first real response to President Moon's Berlin speech. It was longer than President Moon's speech. It was very critical, and even though it did not castigate him by name. So there are a lot of question marks here, and so it's an effort to test the waters. I'm not surprised that President Moon has made it, but I don't think he wants to be too far out in front of this larger strategy that is an effort to impose new sanctions on the North. Now,
Mr. Teng in Beijing, what does this offer mean? It is not just talking to Pyongyang. It is talking to the international community and the regional powers, including China, about what South Korea is trying to offer to Pyongyang. So now, is this also putting China into a challenging, even more challenging situation? That if Pyongyang would not respond positively to this offer by South Korea, China will have even fewer options not to follow what South Korea and the United States originally were talking about, which is having bigger sanctions, more pressure onto Pyongyang.
Actually, Chinese government already has given a very clear-cut position toward the policy by Moon Jae-in, and our spokesman from ministry said that China will be 100% in favor of any contact between the two sides in Korean Peninsula. It seems to us that President Moon Jae-in would like to have a policy very different from the previous two presidents of ROK. And it seems to us that this is a continuation of the sunshine policy by the former ROK president. But I think the reality is that the situation in Korean Peninsula is very different from 10 years ago. So Moon Jae-in's policy is a good idea, but I don't think will be any significant impact on the situation in the peninsula.
When you talk about 10 years ago, let's take a look at what kinds of offers has been given, provided by South Korea to North Korea earlier, 10 years ago. From the year 1998 to the year 2008, there was a flurry of talks and exchange programs between Pyongyang and Seoul. During that period of time, two liberal South Korean presidents went to Pyongyang and held landmark summit talks with then leader Kim Jong Il, the father of Kim Jong Un. Kim Jong Il, meanwhile, sent his premier, top security head, to Seoul for talks as well. In August 2015, DPRK's #2 leader and South Korea's national security director also met at a place that commonly agreed by the two sides and reached a deal on averting possible bloodshed over a landmine blast. So there seems to be a lot of close interactions from time to time. And yet, Mr. Polak, what Mr. Tang here in China said perfectly well, that is, time has gone by and things have dramatically changed. One of the things, Mr. Polak, you know better than anyone else, is the DPRK has developed a very high capability when it comes to producing nuclear weapons possibility toward the United States. So how patient do you think all sides will give DPRK to respond to this offer coming from South Korea? Secondly, the question is, do we have other options as DPRK is getting ever closer to the point?
Well, first of all, I would agree very much with Mr. Tang that things have moved on, not only in terms of North Korea's military capabilities, but also we're now dealing with a very different leader in Kim Jong Un, who really has, so far as I know, has not met with any foreign leader to this point. So those are objective conditions that we must be mindful of. I think the challenge here for President Moon is, having put this offer, so to speak, on the table, that he can't repeatedly chase after Pyongyang if Pyongyang does not provide any kind of meaningful response to it, or proposes something that would so disadvantage South Korea and so disadvantage the larger strategy in which China also participates in trying to inhibit North Korea's nuclear weapons and missile development.
Right.
I don't think anyone believes that sanctions alone are a solution to this. It's a much bigger question, but the challenge here fundamentally is to impose costs on North Korea, to make it more difficult for it to sustain these weapons programs, which are a danger to the peninsula, to the region, and to the United States.
Mr. Kim, how much time and space do you think South Korea and the current administration would give to Pyongyang in terms of their response and the nature of their response?
The Minister of Unification, Jo Myung-gun, has already stated that the South Korean government will take a steady and very patient approach with regards to dialogues with North Korea. So it seems to me that even if the response is negative, that the administration will still look for opportunities of dialogue. The danger here, obviously, is that if the North Koreans do agree to a dialogue, then there is a problem for the United States to think through on whether or not to follow through on with the South Korean lead on the dialogue, how far they're willing to go in terms of waiting out to see whether these dialogues result in any meaningful outcomes, or the United States decides to go its own path and essentially raise tensions in the region, which can potentially derail the dialogue process altogether. So this is, there's a coordination problem on the other side should North Korea agree to this discussion, which is part of the reason why I think the response from Washington and also in Tokyo to this overture has been relatively lukewarm at best. The view from the Trump administration is that they're going to defer to Seoul on exactly what is going to result from this exchange.
Right. There are two things, Mr. Polak. Before I go to Mr. Tang, I do want you to help us understand better. One is, this could be a strategy. Whether DPRK agreed to the talks or in a way try to wait until a certain time to come out with certain message. A way for them to delay the process of further sanctions against the DPRK. This could also be an opportunity that DPRK seek to eventually talk to the United States through, first of all, a talk with South Korea. But the question really is, as much as it is in the hands of DPRK to decide the nature of this, it is also in the hands of Washington, D.C. to decide where things are going from here. Mr. Polak, what about that thinking process now in Washington?
Well, the Trump administration has tried to articulate and pursue and pay a great deal of attention to its strategies towards North Korea. There's some uncertainty about how fully a lot of these plans will be implemented, although very frankly, some that are now under consideration might very, very well include the additional possibilities of secondary sanctions that go beyond the ones that the U.S. has undertaken to this point. So then that involves China as well. I think it's understood that communication with North Korea under the best of circumstances is extremely difficult. And I can understand President Moon's desire to try to open the door just a little, but North Korea has made very, very clear that in its view, South Korea plays no role whatsoever with respect to anything pertaining to the nuclear weapons and missile program. They've been very, very explicit.
So the question really is, Mr. Polak, it is about North Korea, the DPRK, and the United States. So in whichever case, whether there's going to be a dialogue between the North and the South, what is likely to be the response of this Trump administration? And of course, we need to bear in mind that Washington is now in a paralysis rather than in the best time of his strength. So is there going to be a rational decision coming out?
You're asking me for a crystal ball that I don't possess. I think, though, that despite the Trump administration's great political difficulties at present, there is an ongoing process through the national security system that is addressing many of these issues, and which I think the president accepts in the midst of all this other turmoil. But there's so much will depend, frankly, on what North Korea does or does not decide to do at this point. And for that, we are all waiting to see.
Whatever the two sides do, it will always be in the interest of China to have a very close eye on and make sure that the two will come to some kinds of conclusion and agreement. But Mr. Tang, that role has been very challenging. So at this point, what options does China have?
Actually, we have three choices on the table. First, dialogue. Second, sanction, and the last is war against each other. I think, as proposed, I think any party concerned in this region, for example, the two Koreans and United States, China. So there is a possibility for the military clash in this region, and I think China's position is very clear, as we discussed now. Actually two-way to suspension and to wait to go for the solution to the DPRK nuclear issue. I think to be frank, I'm not so optimistic about President Moon's proposal at this moment. 2 points I'd like to mention here. The first, can President Moon go far away from the point right now? I don't think he could have an independent policy toward DPRK at this moment. The second, does any country, quite familiar, knows that the the leader of DPRK, Kim Jong Un, wants to have? The nuclear armed DPRK might be the #1 job for Kim Jong Un at this moment. I don't think Kim Jong Un will give any compromise in this regard at this moment. So 2 points are very important. All the participants should have a clear-cut idea on this issue.
But the United States, since Trump administration comes into power, their original belief is to exert more pressure on China so that the pressure can be handed over to Pyongyang because of close relationship between these two countries in history. But China have already said very clearly, we can't do that, not at least to a certain extent. Then the thing becoming ever more complicated because eventually the pressure will be on China's shoulder, even though China shouldn't, as it believes, shoulder those responsibilities. But that's the only country that the U.S. could talk to in terms of exerting any pressure on DPRK. So how is China going to come out of that very cornered situation, which is not created by itself?
Generally speaking, I think the role played by the Chinese government has been very important in dealing with the DPRK nuclear issue, so far.
Yeah.
But I don't think China has been the key player in this game. The two players are DPRK and the United States. At every, specific occasion, the two sides always, played game of war, of the nuclear issue. So this is not China's responsibility to deal with such a challengeable issue in this region.
Okay, so Mr. Kim, 2 things. One choice is that maybe dialogues and talks could begin. Maybe Pyongyang would change its approach to work with the South or the United States international community as well. But maybe at the same time, it is still developing its nuclear weapon program. The other thing is North would just dismiss any offer by both the neighbor and the international community, even in the United States, and continue to develop its nuclear weapons program. So all of these possibilities exist. How are players going to prepare for the worst scenario and the best scenario, particularly South Korea?
First of all, let me just state for the record that Dr. Pollack's original statement about the Allies' position on dialogue, I would have to agree with that. Both the United States, South Korea, and Japan as well all agree that a dialogue of some form is a sort of an eventual sort of endgame or part of a very important turning point in all this. The U.S. position has always been that that it wants to decide and determine the terms of that dialogue. And as I stated earlier, it seems South Korea wants to test where, and as Dr. Pollack has pointed out earlier, that some possible areas or pockets of meaningful issues where the two sides can come to some sort of an agreement on. So I think everybody agrees that dialogue is an important a tool. They would like to get there, but they would like to get there on their terms and not have North Korea define those terms. That's number one. Number two, what I'd like to also point out is that I'm not sure it's a choice among these very extreme cases that, either a dialogue or some sort of an agreement or a war. I think there are some other possibilities in between, short of war. And that is, I think we're giving less weight to the role of deterrence in all this. That if North Korea continues to develop its nuclear capability and eventually reaches a point where it crosses that red line, that it's able to miniaturize a nuclear weapon on top of an ICBM, it doesn't necessarily mean that North Korea will actually use that capability. And the way that I define use here is that North Korea actually launches an ICBM, a nuclear-tipped ICBM. North Korea could very well have every intention to deter a potential attack from one of its adversaries. In same regard, I think if North Korea's capability has increased, to some extent there has to be a balance in the region when we're talking about South Korea and Japan. Yes, we do have extended deterrence and the U.S. nuclear umbrella, which has protected and kept the peace in the region. But if there's any possibility that North Korea could potentially use this capability, I think South Korea and Japan would also like to have some sort of assurance on their end to deter a potential attack from North Korea.
I see.
What that means is a potential here for an arms buildup.
Mr. Teng, you want to respond to that? We only have 45 seconds to go.
Yeah, I think the reality is that every country in this region now had the opportunity of finding a good solution in dealing with DPRK nuclear use, not only because the capability of DPRK has become real and directed to the countries concerned, but also all the countries should face the same challenge at the same time. This is a very urgent job for all the countries concerned.
And final words for you, Mr. Polak, very briefly, please.
Yes, I think it's the most important thing is that we cannot let great distance be created between all the affected powers here. It's very important now, in particular, I think, for the United States and China to work on a common strategy, not one that is separate in different avenues. It's essential under these circumstances, truly essential.
Things are moving fast, things are ever changing, and that makes this specific story ever more fascinating and certainly cause a lot of concern along the way. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Teng Jianqun, James Kim, Jonathan Polak. Really appreciate it. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing. Still to come on our program, our first episode in our series of interviews with scientists who want to use existing technology to mitigate humanity's footprint. Today, we speak to Professor Andrew Gonzalez, who uses big data to fight biodiversity loss. We also check in on the U.S.-China 100-day action plan agreed by President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump. This plan includes Chinese cooked chicken in reaching the United States market, while U.S. beef heads in the other direction for China. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Urbanization has been the trend of many countries since the Industrial Revolution. Although initially regarded as an advance in the quality of human life, problems quickly emerged. To accommodate the rapidly growing population in cities, the world witnessed a catastrophic ecosystem reduction during the Third Industrial Revolution. Different kinds of biotic members of an ecosystem, together with their roots and factors, depend on each other. This means the absence of one animal can adversely affect all parties in an ecosystem. Human-caused environmental damage has led to a huge loss in biodiversity as well. With global warming becoming more tangible, ideas to mitigate the harmful effects of modern cities are increasing. So, in the first episode of our special series of interviews with scientists, we talked to Professor Andrew Gonzalez, Canada Research Chair in the Biodiversity Science and also Director of Quebec Centre for Biodiversity Science. His research is broadly focused on the causes and consequences of biodiversity loss and the stability and functioning of ecosystems. Professor Gonzalez uses experiments in the field and the lab, theory and databases to tackle these problems. What inspired you to become a scientist, especially a scientist about biodiversity?
That's a great question. I was exposed as a 5-year-old to the BBC documentaries on nature by David Attenborough, and I had a book for Christmas. It was the first book called Life on Earth, and I used to wander around the house with that book. My grandmother said to me, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to be David Attenborough." And so media and science communication made me want to be a scientist.
So what about technologies now? In hindsight, are they really likely to help us?
The fourth industrial revolution is about combining digital technologies and nature, the information revolution with nature. So how are we inspired by nature, but how can we use technology to bring nature into the city? And I think that's very promising.
But the question is, do we understand nature enough?
No.
To come up with the good solutions and bring them into our future development? Are we bringing in the wrong type, or are we doing in the right type? That's a lot of responsibilities on your shoulder, I have to say.
That's my career. My science is about trying to figure that out. And our approach is that you won't get the right answer straight away. We have this adaptive management. You start by building a solution. Does it work? Yes, it's working. You do a bit more and you add nature.
How big data and the visualization of big data is helping us to understand our ecosystem, especially in cities?
Every city is unique, has a unique history, but there are many common trends. So cities from the industrialized world, let's say European and North American cities, have a very particular pattern of growth, and they lost nature in a particular way. Developing cities are growing very, very fast as well, but in each case they've eroded nature. So our models allow us to show that pattern and how we can design, we can apply the science to design cities better, whether that's London or Singapore or Shanghai or Montreal. It's the same science, the same approach. And so the idea is, if we can use data to manage green space in cities, we can improve people and we can improve nature. So what happens is we show them a map, and maps are amazing things. Everyone can stand around a map and look at a map and point to where they live. And so our maps show where we can put green space, and what we can do is we can show a map for today, but our models and our data also make projections for the future. So we can say, this is what Montreal will look like in 2050 or 2100, and say, look, if we do this now, this is all the benefits that we have in the future. If we don't, if we stay with business as usual, then we're going to lose all this nature.
Montreal, already a beautiful city. You don't have any problem, do you?
That nature is not equally distributed throughout the city. Some places have very little nature, very small ecosystems, and there are parts with much more nature. So we want to improve that by using networks. We want to build a network of green space and ecosystems in the city. And so we've been using data to show how we can how can we design a network for a big city like Montreal so that everybody has access to that nature and to that biodiversity.
Tell me about the trees.
And so in Montreal, for example, Canadian maple tree is well known, is very resilient. We have in Canada right now an invasive beetle, which is coming in and killing the ash trees in Montreal, but not just in Montreal, all over North America. Millions of trees are dying right now. And so people are trying to find the right combinations of trees to push back this invasive beetle. And so this is the day-to-day of working with organisms, trying to manage these ecosystems, but also working with the government to help them understand.
But they would say, this is our national tree. We need to have as many as possible. Tourists love them.
They do, and we have many of them, but we're worried about their future. And we're worried about how we manage. If we stay business as usual with how we manage our ecosystems, we will lose our national tree.
How would you convince them?
Well, we convince them through engaging them from the beginning of the research. So I had a telephone call from the government. They said, Andy, we would like you to apply your research. So from the get-go, we had them around the table and said, this is how we apply the science. What do you think? How should we do it? And they advise us. And so all the way through, we have the co-design of the science. So that by the end, it's not a surprise. We say, this is the solution. This is our map. This is where you should plant your ecosystems. And they already agree. They understand where it came from, where the science and the data come from.
But you know, there's an issue. There's a huge difference between ecological system that is naturally developed and ecological system that is artificially produced. What you said just now and the advice you give to the localities really belongs to the second part. Even though they could eventually become the first choice, it takes a lot of time. Will that really help us to solve the problem?
Those ecosystems that we design will be simple to begin with. They won't have the rich complexity of natural systems, but we have to start somewhere. We have to progressively build the richness and the diversity, the biological diversity of those ecosystems. And by connecting urban people to nature, we recover our roots, we help child development. So there's research showing that child development and the capacity of children to appreciate nature increases as we expose them to nature. So the next generation will appreciate nature more, and then we develop a richer ethic for nature, right. And I think that's worth doing.
What is the next stage of technological development and its combination with the research going on of our cities, as you see it?
I think it's a combination of information from satellites and space, very quick capture of data on the health of ecosystems, and then people on the ground putting digital systems into ecosystems so they can measure the health of ecosystems. So if you connect the data coming from the ground and from satellite, apply those to our models, we can create sophisticated understanding of how these ecosystems will respond to change. So my analogy is that meteorology, people who predict the weather, we will be able to do the same thing for ecosystems.
And what kind of cities would you like your children to live in?
A greener city, a healthier city, a more biologically rich city, full of human diversity and biological diversity.
As simple as that, as complicated as that.
Exactly.
And it's such a pleasure to have you.
It's been a pleasure.
All the best for your work. Thank you so much. You're watching World Insight. 3 months after Chinese President Xi Jinping's meeting with his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump in Florida and their second encounter at the recent G20 summit in Germany, the first round of the China-U.S. Comprehensive Economic Dialogue is finally kicking off tomorrow. Under their U.S.-China 100-day action plan, Beijing agreed to accept U.S. beef imports in exchange for Washington accepting Chinese cooked chicken imports. U.S. beef has already arrived in China, but where is the Chinese chicken? Take a look.
Since 2015, China has blocked U.S. chicken products from crossing its borders. That's because of an outbreak of bird flu in Minnesota.
I know what a healthy bird looks like, and these looked a little bit sick.
But 2 years later, following Chinese President Xi Jinping's summit with U.S. President Donald Trump in April, Washington agreed to allow imports of cooked chicken from China. The next goal, coaxing Beijing to open its market back up to U.S. poultry producers.
We've been working, trying to get Chinese chicken into the U.S. for many years because we think it's a basic principle that we hold to, and that's has to do with free and open trade.
In June, Sumner says, the U.S. got its first shipment of cooked chicken from China, but the birds were actually raised in Chile, then taken all the way to China to be cooked, then all the way back to the United States for sale.
It's definitely inefficient, and it's largely a symbolic gesture.
Brian Ronholm used to oversee food inspections for the U.S. Agriculture Department. He says this deal brings Beijing one step closer to exporting chicken, not just to Americans, but beyond.
With the food safety scandals that they've experienced over the last decade or so, for them, the ultimate goal is reestablishing credibility in the world market when it comes to food safety. And achieving equivalency determination status with the U.S. helps them in that process.
Already, the U.S. has declared these 4 Chinese plants have met safety standards equivalent to American facilities, and it's proposed a rule that would also allow them to export chickens raised and slaughtered in China to the United States. Ultimately, though, the White House will control when that rule is approved. And Jim Sumner says when it does, U.S. poultry producers are hoping Beijing will reciprocate, and Chinese restaurants will once again welcome American chicken feet to their menus. Chicken paws sales, he says, are nothing to squawk at.
Jumbo paws to China bring 90 to over $1 a pound. And if you had the option of selling it locally for 5 cents or exporting it for over $1, it's a no-brainer.
Jessica Stone, CGTN, Washington.
For more in-depth analysis on the first round of China-U.S. Comprehensive Economic Dialogue, please stay tuned to our program tomorrow on Wednesday. Then we're going to have both sides talk about that. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, in your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.